Hi, welcome to the 14-day weather forecast. Wet, windy and mild sums up the start to 2023, at least in most of the UK. Are things set to change during the next 2 weeks? Well, as usual, I'll take a look at the prospects, but also I'm going to have a brief look later on at the possibility of a sudden stratospheric warming event. I'll try and explain what one of those is and its potential impacts on the UK's weather. But coming back to week one, and the animation here runs from 18 GMT, Wednesday the 4th of January. At the outset, a west or southwesterly flow pushing right across the UK. It's keeping things unsettled and mild for weather coming in from the Atlantic. As I run this, not a great deal changes in the short term. Further bands of cloud and rain pushing from the west. The tightly packed isobars mean strong winds as well. Into the weekend, a nasty looking area of low pressure centred to the west of the northwest, close to Iceland. It's bringing the unsettled conditions across all areas. And not much changes even looking further ahead. Further spells of rain, perhaps more of a northwesterly tilt for a time, so somewhat colder air moving across the UK, but then into the early part of next week, the Atlantic is really continuing to barrel through right across all parts of the UK, northwestern Europe. It's keeping the unsettled theme in place. Perhaps some tentative suggestions here of high pressure beginning to have more influence, at least in southern and central regions. All in all, though, a very, very mixed picture right through the first week, according to this animation. Will it be cold? Well, as I've already said, with the Atlantic driving things, the short answer is no. On this air temperature chart, the blues and purples are used to indicate where the cold air is. The UK is just here under the greens initially. As I run this, the blues, the deep blues and purples, they never make it to the UK. Areas of low pressure, they're moving across. Somewhat colder air at times. Also warmer sectors were moving through. You saw some yellow and orange crossing the UK. It's temperatures fluctuating, but all in all, close to or above the average for most of the period, perhaps a little bit colder here at the end, the light blue shading indicating that, but certainly nothing of note at the 850 HPA level, which this is showing, so approximately 1,500 meters above sea level. How does that correspond to what we can expect down at the surface? So the actual temperatures that we experience, 15 GMT, Thursday the 5th, mild in much UK, 12s, 13s in southern and central regions, colder there in Scotland. Also some mild nights to come as well, so 06 GMT Saturday here, double figures, very, very mild for time of year there, much of England, colder in Scotland. And moving forwards to Monday the 9th of January, looking at maximums again. It's a bit cooler here, between 7 and 8 Celsius in southern and central counties, a few degrees lower in the north. And in terms of overnight lows on Tuesday the 10th, this is about as low as I could find through the first week. 3s, 4s and 5s there in England and Wales, dipping down to freezing or a little bit below in Scotland. Those four charts really are just used to illustrate the range of daytime and nighttime temperatures through week one. At the top end, 13s in the south, at the bottom end closer to 7 or 8 Celsius during the day, so average to mild and correspondingly mild nights generally, but somewhat colder at least in the north on some of them. It's not just the UK, it's been very mild in continental Europe as well. A snow shortage in the Alps, particularly at lower levels. Here's the forecast temperatures for 15 GMT, Thursday the 5th. Much of France, 12, 13 Celsius, a bit cold there where the light blue is. That's the Alps, of course, but nothing like where it should be for this time of the year. But if you are hoping to go skiing in the next few weeks, there is somewhat better news, because if I move forwards to Monday the 9th of January, 15 GMT again, there's blue shading now covering the Alps, so temperatures have dipped. In France and Germany, we're back down into single figures at this point. Also a more changeable theme pushing across the Alps, bringing a greater risk of sleet and snow at times towards the end of the first week. So perhaps things there starting to improve, but it really is pretty poor down at low levels at the moment in the French Alps in particular, and I think the Swiss Alps too. More important in the UK than temperatures through week 1 will be the rain, which I'll take a look at briefly in a moment, but also the strength of the winds. Two forecast charts here are from the Met Office UKV model. The one on the left is for Friday the 6th. You can see very strong winds there to the west and north of Scotland, 60 miles an hour or higher. The chart on the right is Saturday evening, and the strongest winds there in western coastal counties, also in parts of northwestern Scotland. So I'm just using those to illustrate that it is going to be windy on a number of days through the first week. Of course, the details are uncertain at this range, but in general terms, it looks as though the strongest winds will be in the northwest and in western coastal counties. Just taking a look at the MOGREPS G ensemble showing forecast wind gusts for London. It indicates a windy picture on several days, gusts going up to or above 40 miles an hour on a number of the individual runs within the ensemble model. I think it's always a little bit a case of keeping an eye on the details, as I say, as the time approaches, but it doesn't look as though we're going to be seeing damage in winds, at least in the southeast. It's windy, but not exceptionally so for the time of the year. But it's not going to feel pleasant with all that rain pushing across, as well as it being very, very blustery on some days. Now, in terms of the amounts of rain, here are the forecast amounts in millimetres for days 0 to 5 from the ECM and GFS models. Wettest in the west is the message. Moving forwards to days 0 to 10, it's the same once more. The highest totals are in western parts of the UK, particularly western Scotland, northwestern England, western Wales, where the orange shading is indicating values of over 100 millimetres. But all parts of the country seeing significant amounts of rain if these are correct. So the reservoirs continue to steadily fill up after that very, very dry summer which we had last year. Now, do the deterministic models agree with each other at the end of the first week? Is it the generally unsettled picture which this model, the GFS, was showing? So Wednesday, the 11th of January, high pressure there to the south, maybe having a little bit more influence for a time, but it's the Atlantic which is driving things. Looking at the Canadian model, a very, very similar story. Low pressure to the west, to the northwest, high pressure to the south. The German icon, the same really as ever. There are some subtle differences, but the general theme is a similar one. The European ECM, a positive North Atlantic oscillation pattern, so the Atlantic in charge. Perhaps though, high pressure may having a little bit more of a say in things in the south, at least for a time. Finally, the UK Met Office Global, the same old story, low pressure just to the south there of Iceland, a west or southwesterly flow pushing across the UK into northwestern Europe in general, high pressure just down there, perhaps reducing rainfall amounts in southern Britain on some days at least. All in all though, good agreement between the deterministics. It's an unsettled pattern which is dominating across northwestern Europe, the UK, rather mild with winds coming in from the west or the southwest, just the chance there in Scotland of it being a little bit colder at times. Will that continue to be the theme through week 2, or are things going to be changing? At this range, of course, it's the ensemble data. I'm going to start as usual with the 16-day GEFS plot for London. Air mass temperatures across the top there, well, the thick black line is a 30-year average, and we've got runs climbing above it and dipping below it. All in all, the ensemble mean stays close to that thick black line. It could be masking the outcome to a certain extent, though. It could well be a zonal pattern with warmer and cooler air masses crossing the UK. And as we actually approach this time, we could see a sine wave pattern starting to appear on the plot. So some days with significantly above average temperatures at the 850 HPA level, so 1,500 meters or so above sea level, and some where most of the runs are going below it. All in all though, it doesn't look at all cold. It looks very, very typical. Rainfall and snowfall across the bottom. The number of spikes there is reasonably consistent. It suggests an ongoing risk of rain, some drier days possibly though as well, maybe high pressure having more influence in the south. Snow, the snow row, it reaches a maximum of 2. 2 of the individual runs on this plot forecasting snow to fall. That's out of a total of 33, and that's the highest value the snow row reaches. It suggests, you should never say this, but virtually no chance or no significant chance of snowfall in the London area during week 2 of the forecast period. It could change, of course. Even ensemble data does shift around. It's not just for deterministics, but there isn't really much sign of it at the moment. 2 meter temperatures, so again, the ones we experience rather than the ones way above our heads. Maximums on each given day being shown in these columns. The light greens, 6 to 10 Celsius. The yellows there, the very mild runs, 11 to 15, and the darker greens, the colder ones in a very, very small minority. A strong signal for temperatures to be close to or above the average through the second week. Moving up to Manchester, I won't labour this point too much because the air temperature profile is very similar to London. Likewise, the number of rain spikes isn't vastly different. It's quite an unsettled picture, an ongoing chance of rain, a very low chance of snow, perhaps just a little bit higher than in London. The snow row reaching a maximum of 5. I don't think it's going to be a particularly wintry scene, though, looking out of windows in Manchester through week 2, unless maybe you can see the higher parts of the Pennines where there could be a little bit of snow on some days. 2 meter temperatures for Manchester, very, very similar to London. The light greens dominant, although not as dominant as they were on the London data table, so a little bit colder as you head northwards. Perhaps something of a cooling trend later on, but a very, very weak one. Even at the very end of the forecast period, there's a significant amount of light green and yellow showing up in those columns. It does not look cold. Up to Glasgow, there are some differences here. The air temperature profile shows the ensemble mean dipping more frequently below the thick black line, the 30-year norm, but it's not deviating from it a great deal. All in all, though, close to or even slightly below the average at this level. There are more rain spikes appearing than there were on the London and Manchester plots. Also, the snow row is significantly higher. It reaches 10 and 11 on a couple of the days through the second week and just beyond it. A low to moderate risk of snowfall in this area, according to the ensemble data. I think, again, it looks good for the Scottish mountains, the potential for significant snowfall in the Scottish ski resorts. That's quite a big contrast with what we've seen in the Alps recently. But down at low levels, it's going to be mostly rain, I would suspect. And the 2 meter temperature data table for Glasgow really supports that theme. There is still a significant amount of the light green showing up, but less than there was on the Manchester and London tables. A reasonable amount of dark green there, runs going for between 1 and 5 Celsius, so in fact it's the majority on most of the days. Just a little bit of blue, just the odd run going for the really cold conditions. Probably close to average temperatures down at the ground level for much of the second week in Scotland, maybe colder on some days. That risk of snow perhaps dropping down from the higher mountains to the hills and even possibly to low levels on 1 or 2 days, but I don't think it's going to be hanging around. It's a changeable theme with all those rain spikes showing up, quite an unsettled scenario with maybe some incursions of colder polar maritime air from the west, the northwest. Very typical for the time of the year. Here's the 10-day GEFS mean surface level pressure plot. So Saturday the 14th of January, low pressure air close to Iceland, high pressure to the southwest near to the Azores, an Atlantic flow pushing right across the UK. It's an unsettled scenario which has been favoured, maybe drier at times in the south, but with winds coming in from the Atlantic, it's not cold. And that message is reinforced by the European ensemble mean pressure plot for the same time. High pressure to the south, the southwest, low pressure to the north, northwest, a westerly flow once again right across the UK and into much of continental Europe. The mean surface level pressure data table for York, does it give any pointers, any trends through the second week? It's been very mixed recently and it continues to be quite difficult to read because through the second week here, there's some orange, those runs going for high pressure, 1026 to 1040 millibars, but there's also a significant amount of green and a little bit of blue. Those are runs going for lower pressure and quite a lot of yellow as well, which straddles both above and below average mean surface level pressure values. But I think taking it in its entirety, there's just possibly a weak signal later on for high pressure to be having more influence, certainly more than is the case early on through the first week. There's more yellows and oranges starting to appear as we go into and through the second week. Do the postage stamp pressure forecast from the GEFS give any more clues? The chart here is for the 16th of January. As ever, it's difficult to see these individual frames, each one showing the forecast output from one of the runs in the ensemble. But if you freeze it, if you want to count them yourself and you don't trust my judgment, the message is there isn't a strong signal here. High pressure though just possibly having more influence than it has earlier on in the 2-week period. Now, I started off by saying I would discuss sudden stratospheric warming and whether it's going to be having an impact on the UK's weather or not through the next few weeks. Before I discuss what an SSW is, it's just worth bearing in mind what the stratosphere is. It is the layer of the atmosphere above the troposphere. The troposphere is the bottom 10 kilometers where virtually all of our weather occurs. The stratosphere is between 10 and 50 kilometers above the Earth's surface. But the important point is what happens in the stratosphere can have an impact on the troposphere, so it does have a bearing on the weather which we experience. And particularly in the winter months, there's a lot of attention given to this because of a phenomenon called sudden stratospheric warming. What sudden stratospheric warming is when the winds in the polar vortex, those are at 50 degrees north and northwards towards the North Pole. It's also the same is true in the south, it's in the southern hemisphere with South Pole. But when those winds at 50 degrees north or further north towards the pole slow down or go into reverse. Now, when that happens, cold air descends and temperatures in the stratosphere rise rapidly up to 60 Celsius in 2 or 3 days. And how often do sudden stratospheric warming events occur? Well, the statistics suggest about 6 times each decade. What happens to the weather after a sudden stratospheric warming event? Well, the effects propagate down to the troposphere over a period of 2 or 3 weeks, and the jet stream pattern changes. Often in the winter months, it tends to be quite flat across the North Atlantic and areas of low pressure push towards the UK. The cold Arctic air remains bottled up to the north. But after an SSW, the jet stream tends to become wavier or more amplified, and when that occurs, cold Arctic air is more likely to move southwards towards mid-latitude locations such as the United Kingdom. Putting all that together, a sudden stratospheric warming event increases the chance of cold weather in the UK 2 weeks or more after it has actually occurred, because it does take time for those effects in the stratosphere to propagate down to lower levels. It's important though as well to remember that an SSW does not guarantee cold weather in the UK, not by any means. It just increases the chance of a cold period happening. Is an SSW imminent? Another way of phrasing the question is, how far ahead is it possible to reliably forecast one? Generally, the view seems to be about 7 days. With that said though, the ensemble data does go significantly further ahead and it can give some indications of whether anything is stirring or not. So I'll take a look at a few charts, starting with these from the GFS model. They are showing forecast wind speeds and directions high up in the stratosphere. This one is on Thursday, the 5th of January. Clearly, the winds there flowing in a zonal pattern around the North Pole, which is just somewhere here, the UK down here. Moving forwards to the 10th of January, not a great deal has changed. Winds still flowing nicely there, and even by the 18th, it's a similar picture. There are changes, of course, but there's the North Pole, and at this point, nothing of note has really happened. It's still, there hasn't been an SSW and there isn't really any sign of one. What about the ensemble data? The GFS output here, each line shows the forecast from one of the runs within the ensemble. Going across the bottom is time, so we start on the 5th of January and go out to the 19th. The vertical axis is showing zonal wind speeds in the stratosphere, so these are nothing to do with what we're having down at the surface. All the runs are very, very tightly packed together through the first several days. So there's a little dip in speeds there from just around 50 to about 40, but then most of them show an increase once again around the 11th of January before they start to dip a little bit from the 12th, and the spread increases towards the end, the run starting to diverge more, which of course is very typical. The further ahead you look, the more possible scenarios will start to be generated by the different runs within the ensemble model. The key point though is none of them are coming down here. Not one is approaching this reversal line where winds are going from a positive westerly flow in the stratosphere to a negative easterly one, so a reversal. But really, according to this data, doesn't seem to be much happening through the next 16 days. Remember that even once an SSW happens, it takes several weeks for its effects to be felt down at the surface. If this is correct, we probably can't expect to see anything developing until the last third of January in the stratosphere. It would then be several more weeks, as I say, so we'd be looking at the first half of February at the earliest for a change to be occurring in the UK's weather as a result of developments in the stratosphere. Therefore, is an SSW imminent? According to a number of reports I've seen on social media, it is, but the evidence here suggests it is not. Definitely keep an eye out through the coming weeks. We could have an SSW, but it's not really been suggested just at the moment. Well, coming back to the next 2 weeks, and to summarise, week 1, it's often going to be wet and windy, temperatures mostly close to or above the average, snow restricted to high ground in Scotland. Week 2, the unsettled theme continues, so further wet and windy spells, particularly in the north and west. There could be some snow in Scotland, generally over high ground, however, there is that chance of it falling to lower levels on occasion. Temperatures mostly close to or above the average in southern and central parts of the UK, colder on some days in the north. And there is a weak signal. It's not at all clear that this will happen, but there are signs perhaps of high pressure beginning to bring an increasing chance of drier periods towards the end of the second week. So, there we have it. More of the same sums things up. Often wet, often windy, generally mild, at least in southern and central parts of the UK. Head northwards and the chance of colder incursions increases, but nothing out of the ordinary. After all, it is January. Could a sudden stratospheric warming event really shake things up and deliver a big change to the UK's weather? Yes, it could, but at the moment computer models are not forecasting one. And even if one did occur, its impacts wouldn't be felt for 2 to 3 weeks afterwards. I think if a SSW is to be a player this winter, February is the month to look to, not before then, so not through the rest of January. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful. As ever, if you did, then please remember to hit the like and subscribe buttons below. Thank you for watching now. Bye.